Good evening and a warm welcome to everyone joining us today for this evening's webinar. I am Brian Irvin, Comms and Engagement here at Cray. As you may already know, here at the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, we are a team of autistic and non-autistic staff and students based within UCL's Institute of Education and part of the Department of Psychology and Human Development. Here at Cray, we aim to conduct high-quality, cutting-edge research, but also to ensure that the results of the research reach those who stand to benefit from it. This Cray webinar series is just one part of that, allowing people both within and beyond academia to hear from some of the key researchers, practitioners, and advocates in the field. Through everything we do at Cray, we take a participatory approach, which means we work with autistic people in all stages of our research and initiatives, from the initial design right through to the sharing of the outcomes. We hope that this means that the work we do is meaningful to the wider autistic community. At this point, I'd like to say a big thank you to our fundraisers, supporters, and team members who contribute to our work and make it all possible. In particular, a special thank you to the Pears Foundation for their generous ongoing support that underpins everything that we do. As always, we invite you to become part of the conversation either in the chat or I can never say the word anonymity, with more anonymity in the Q&A. We will endeavour to have as many questions answered as we can by Jo, and we will stop recording at that point. So today we have the wonderful Jo Billington. Jo is an autism researcher at the University of Reading. Her research focuses on the everyday experiences of autistic children in mainstream primary schools. She is also the co-founder of the Centre for Autism Wellbeing Hub, a project which aims to explore autistic thriving with autistic children, their families, and supporting professionals. So Jo, it's over to you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to everyone at Cray for the invitation to come and talk to you this afternoon. Thank you. Yes, so I am here to talk to you about what was really quite a small-scale study. It is a small-scale study, but it had a profound effect upon me as a researcher, the direction of the PhD research that I did, and also just my thinking in terms of an academic, in terms of a practitioner, as a citizen, and also as a parent of autistic children myself. Before I continue, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I think it's really important to talk about my positionality, so the lens through which I conduct my research. So that will help you understand the interpretations that I've made through my analyses. I'm a non-autistic autism researcher, and my research is rooted in the neurodiversity paradigm. So essentially what that means is that I don't conceptualize autism as a disorder or a collection of deficits, but that also doesn't mean that I minimize, trivialize, or dismiss the considerable challenges and difficulties that are experienced by autistic people and their families. What I'm really interested in terms of experiences of challenge and disablement are the forces of social justice and stigma and marginalization and how they come to bear on those experiences. I think it's important to stress that the study that I'm going to talk to you about today contains some topics and some themes that could be uncomfortable or upsetting for some people. My talk refers to the bullying and marginalization of autistic children. And if you're autistic yourself or you have an autistic loved one, this can have a personal dimension that is important to recognize. Also, my participants in this study refer to some of their teachers as being instrumental in their invalidation at school. And if you are a teacher or a member of school staff, again, that can be uncomfortable to hear. So I wanted to make these points clear at this stage in case this isn't the right time for you to be listening to this. And if this is something you'd like to revisit at a later point through the recordings when they're published. But the important thing, I think, either way, is to prioritise self-care. So before I continue with talking about the study in detail, I just want to place it within a context by looking at the kind of broader landscape for autistic children within the English school system, which is the context within which my research is conducted. So identified autistic children, that's the key word here, identified. So we know that this is not necessarily representative because, of course, there are lots of unidentified autistic children in our education system. But identified autistic children and young people accounted for just over 2% of the English state-funded school population in the last academic year. And of around those, around 75% were educated in mainstream schools. And around the same percent, so 74, did not have the support of an education, health and care plan. For those of you who don't know what an education, health and care plan is, it's the highest level of educational support or a framework for support for those who are seen to have the highest level of need within our education system. Essentially, an education, health and care plan usually involves a multidisciplinary team of professionals who come together around the child from within the school and also from services outside the school to put together, first of all, to ascertain what the support needs are for the child and then to think about how those support needs will be met. The reason why this is important, though, these data here, is that the vast majority of autistic children in our school system in England are educated in mainstream schools without this kind of multidisciplinary support. That means that the support that they are provided with is largely dependent on the school that they attend, the resources available to that school, the level of knowledge and training and awareness that individual members of staff within that school have. And that then means that the level of support that's available to autistic children with their learning needs is highly variable. It can vary from school to school, but it can also vary from class to class. And when we think about the broader landscape in relation to their non-autistic peers, autistic children and young people in mainstream schools are much more likely to have difficult school experiences and poor educational outcomes. We know that autistic children are much more likely to experience academic underachievement. In fact, the attainment gap between autistic and non-autistic children in our education system, both at Key Stage 2 and at Key Stage 4, so that's the end of primary school and the end of secondary school, is significant and widening, and also can't be adequately explained by academic ability or intellectual ability. We also know that autistic children are much more likely to be bullied and socially isolated while they're at school. And we also know that they're much more likely to be formally and informally excluded from school. So formal exclusions would include either a fixed term exclusion, where the child is asked to leave the school for a fixed period up to 45 days per year, or a permanent exclusion, in which case a new education setting needs to be found for the child. But we know that there's also a lot of informal exclusion that goes on. So examples of this would be something like a part-time timetable for an autistic student because of a lack of support. For example, one of my participants was only able to go to school in the morning because they needed support from a teaching assistant, and that teaching assistant, they didn't have the budget to employ teaching assistants in the afternoon. It could be that they are not allowed to attend school events, school trips, after school clubs, breakfast clubs, etc., again, ostensibly due to a lack of staffing and a lack of support. But we also know that autistic children are much more likely to experience mental health difficulties, but also have considerably more challenges in terms of having those mental health difficulties accurately identified in a timely fashion, and also being able to access the appropriate support to enable them to recover from those mental health challenges. So we know that the broader context is incredibly bleak, in fact. But when we go to the literature, when we go to the existing research, as I did, to kind of understand more about the everyday experience of some of these challenges, because we know a lot about how difficult life can be for autistic children in our school system. But I was interested in learning more about how autistic children make sense of their everyday experiences. And when we go to the literature to try and find that, actually there isn't a great deal written from that perspective. Historically, all of the research that we have, or the bulk of the research that we have about the autistic school experience, comes from the perspective of parents and carers and school staff and other allied professionals. There are relatively few papers that are focused on the subjective experiences as expressed by autistic children themselves. Now, when I started doing this kind of research back in 2015, there was really not very much at all, a handful of papers, if that. And I'm happy to say that that has changed in the intervening years. There is so much more that's been written from the perspective of children. But the majority of the children that do feature in those studies typically attend secondary schools. So they're in their adolescence, some of them are in their early adulthood, and or they have access to, you know, that highest level of support or a specialist resource. Now, with regards to education, health and care plans, across the country, around 4% of the whole school population is supported by an education, health and care plan, but around 25% of autistic children are supported in such a way. When it comes to specialist resources, only around 7% of schools across England have specialist autism resources. So when we're talking about the vast majority of autistic children, as described in the last slide, who attend mainstream schools that don't have resources and they're not supported with education, health and care plans, they are vastly underrepresented in the research literature. And this was really clear to me in the first study that I did for my PhD, which was a systematic review of the qualitative literature. And I was able to identify 78 qualitative studies that were published between the year 2000 and 2022. And they incorporated 277 autistic children. And when I was looking for studies that focused on children in mainstream primary schools that didn't have an education, health and care plan or the international equivalent, or access to specialist autism support, there were 0 studies about that. And in fact, there has been an update to that. There's this paper that's just come out in the last couple of months. And there are a few more papers that have been added to that since I did mine in 2022. But again, that gap in the literature still remains. So if there are any PhD students here or PhD supervisors or researchers looking for a gap in the literature, this is an important gap, I think. So in terms of my PhD, first study of 3 studies in total. The first one was the systematic review that I've just very, very briefly talked about. Study 2, this is the one I'm going to talk about today. This is where I wanted to capture the views of young autistic adults who had already been through their primary school experience to kind of reflect back on their experiences. And the reason why I wanted to do this was not just because it's actually a really valid thing to do anyway, but I wanted it to inform my third study. I wanted it to help me and guide me through my third study, which was to actually work with autistic children in mainstream primary schools who are in years 5 and 6, so ages between 9 and 10. But this study, whilst I initially thought that it was going to be something that was very instrumental in helping me to think about study 3, was actually something that was really enlightening and changed, as I say, my approach to how I conducted my research. So this is what I want to share with you today. So there were 6 participants, 4 female, 2 male, aged between 19 and 24. They were all enrolled in further or higher education, which makes them quite a distinctive group. And the question that guided our conversation was very, very broad, and that was, what was primary school like for you? And 5 of the participants took part in a focus group, and 1 of my participants preferred to have a one-to-one interview. And all of our conversations were audio and video recorded. They were transcribed and then thematically analysed. I did this with the help of my supervision team and also 2 research assistants. And the analysis period was actually very helpfully guided by my autistic adult mentors. I had 3 mentors who helped me throughout my PhD to help me think about autistic culture. And they were very instrumental in helping me with the analysis. So I constructed 4 themes from the data, and I'm going to go through each of those for you now. They were the undesirability of difference, the various guises of bullying, the emotional labour of being good, and looking back. Now, I'm going to be using quotes from my participants here to illustrate the themes. And I just want to acknowledge before I do that there is a discomfort for me for speaking the words of my participants. In an ideal world, we'd have a bit more time where I could present the quotes and you could read them. But because we don't have a huge amount of time today, I am going to read them, but I just wanted to acknowledge the kind of discomfort that I feel in doing that. So in terms of the first theme, the undesirability of difference, all of the participants in the whole group reported feeling different from a very early age. And this difference was universally experienced in a negative way. So this quote from Sophie emphasizes this. She says, "I was just so different from everyone else that not even the teachers really knew how to address me. And I just felt really like I wasn't meant to be there at all." In this theme, participants also talked about how their authentic ways of being in the school environment, so the ways in which they communicated, the ways in which they engaged in the learning activities, the way that they socialized with their classmates, these are often misunderstood as bad or wrong or deviant in some kind of way. And Georgia here says that I often did things which teachers would think was bad behaviour, but it was just me misunderstanding what we were meant to be doing. I was always being told off for things which I didn't understand were wrong. And actually, that sense of being different and the sense of being deviant or wrong in some way also fed into the second theme, which was to do with bullying, but the various kind of forms and guises of bullying. So for most of the participants, in fact, all of them except one, being perceived as different by others was absolutely directly connected to their experiences of bullying. And some of the bullying was overt and it was physical. So, for example, some of the participants reported, having things thrown at them, getting into kind of physical fights and altercations. But actually, what was more common were examples of bullying or experiences of bullying that were much more subtle forms of hostility. So Holly here describes things like being picked later for sports teams, or just not having people to sit with at lunch, or kind of having difficulties like finding the right things to talk about that people would be interested in, or not being invited to birthday parties. And if I'm honest with you, that was when my participants started talking about the bullying, the experiences of bullying that they'd had from their peers in their school setting, as upsetting as it was to hear that, it was expected because of what we know about the very high levels of bullying that happens to autistic children in schools. What was very surprising, though, for me personally, was that the participants also reported bullying from their teachers. They all recounted experiences where a teacher had behaved in ways that the participants perceived as hostile and aggressive. And there was a really strong sense amongst the participants that they weren't liked by their teachers. And Callum here says, "My year 5 teacher used to bully me quite a lot. I don't know why she had such a problem with me, but she just seemed to have this real dislike for me. And I don't know why." And again, Callum's point here kind of hints as well at some of the confusion that the participants expressed around that. They just didn't understand why there was this level of kind of hostility from the adults around them. And when I asked the participants to kind of unpack some of that and to give me some examples and to, if they felt comfortable, if they could describe some of these experiences of bullying by their teachers, it was quite different from the experiences they described with their peers. It was it wasn't so much this, obviously the physical side of things, but really it was about kind of the teachers implying in kind of very subtle and sometimes very overt ways that if my participants were less autistic in some way, that life would be easier for them. So this example here from Daniel, I think really, and these are all pseudonyms, by the way, I think this emphasizes that. And he says, I remember a teacher basically saying, the way that I'll get bullied less, the way you'll get bullied less is if you act like a normal person. And the reason he said that was that I like to just sit and read a book and not go play football. And in the broader conversations with the participants, most of them did express the idea that they felt that their teachers were doing this from a place of goodwill. They recognized that their teachers did want the best for them, and that this may have been, as misguided as this was, it kind of came from a place of wanting the best. But that made no difference, of course, at the time, or indeed, after the fact, many years on. And Georgia says here, my teacher told me that she was doing it for my own good. I was very clear that I didn't want friends, and she thought that made me like selfish, like one day you're going to regret you didn't make friends when you were younger. And Georgia was really clear that actually she was very comfortable with her own company. She really wanted to reject the pressure to kind of have a friendship group and so on. She felt very comfortable kind of occupying her own personal space within the school system, but really kind of felt that her teacher was pushing her into a different direction. And then of course, this sense that, thinking about the other two themes of being undesirably different, and also this pressure to kind of be less themselves and more like something they weren't, led inevitably, to feeling like they needed to do more to be acceptable. So this theme, the emotional labor of being good, participants reported significant pressure to behave in ways that were seen to be more normal. But of course, this resulted in increased levels of anxiety and stress and hypervigilance. Daniel here says, I was always very nervous about trying to fit in potentially. So like making sure I didn't go and do anything that would not be normal. And of course, this feeds into the narratives, so what we know about masking, and just the level of effort and hard work that goes into that in order to just be accepted, or to attempt to be accepted by peers and staff. Holly here is saying, I was always aware that I was different, and so I always strive to be similar, which was obviously really hard as I'm not similar. I had to go to school knowing that I was not going to fit in that day, and things were going to be hard, and teachers were going to be hard. I was putting everything on, and trying so hard to please everyone. And of course, what struck me about this was that this was in addition to the pressures of, the academic challenges, the pressures of being a young person, the impact that has on one's identity and so forth, and just the sheer level of effort and exhaustion that is associated with this came across very strongly in this theme. And something else that happened, or that was discussed in the focus group and in the interview, was how this suppression of emotional response while in school kind of led to a release of some of that tension when the participants got back to the safety of their homes. But this could sometimes lead to tension at home, particularly with close family members, parents, and so on. So Sophie here is saying, in school, I would bottle it up and try and be good to kids and good to teachers. And that's probably why me and my mum never got on, because I probably just exploded on her, really, like just let rip. And I think this kind of leads us into theme 4 about that's really related to the passing of time. But the participants were talking about how how frustrated they felt then and now about the fact that they had to work so hard to try to fit in. But it would seem that those efforts weren't matched in any way by the people in the school or the peers around them. So there was no attempts that were made by the people around them to make any kind of adjustment or to meet halfway, to include them or make any adjustments for their particular needs. And that led Katie to say, incredibly powerful quote, which is what I've used in the title of this paper, and that's that I liked school, but school didn't like me. And so theme 4, looking back, most of the participants, had, let's think, good 10 years since leaving primary school. But there was this sense that actually that time had been needed to be able to fully understand what happened to them. The distance, the time that had passed, and the growth that had taken place in the meantime had been really important in being able to understand the challenges that they'd experienced and contextualize them. So Georgia here is saying, well, at the time, it didn't really seem like it was having an impact on me. I had a very stiff upper lip attitude and just got on with things. And it seemed like I was having a happy childhood, but it kind of came bubbling up and I started getting really bad anxiety over the stupidest things. Nowadays, I can barely leave the house. And really a lot of that is probably because, primary school. So the impact of these challenges that were experienced in early life were still being felt in early adulthood. And this reflecting back on those early experiences led to a lot of strong emotions, understandably. And the difficulties that some of the participants had faced and the long-term impact of those led to very real and present feelings of anger and resentment. Sophie here says, looking back, it just makes me angry. I'm just full of anger. I shouldn't have gone through all that mess. And again, part of this reflection process was thinking about, how things could have been different. And here Callum is saying that, he really wished that he had been more authentically himself during his primary school years. He says, I wasn't really being myself the whole time. And sometimes I would try to pretend to enjoy stuff when I didn't, just to try and kind of feel like I was doing something normal, when in fact, I was just lying to myself. So I would have started being myself earlier. So thinking about the implications of these findings, one of the first things I looked to was the kind of theory to try and make sense of the data and try to make sense of the experiences my participants had shared with me. And the first thing I wanted to look at was bullying. Now, in the literature, bullying is almost exclusively, certainly within school and childhood, it's exclusively conceptualized as a child-to-child phenomenon. And so the conceptualizations of bullying in the literature just didn't really match the descriptions of the bullying that my participants had shared with me about the adults that they had experiences with in school, the teachers and the school staff. And actually kind of taking my reading beyond education, beyond autism and beyond psychology, I found within some of the literature around discrimination to be a really close fit. And these definitions here seem to really capture, from a theoretical perspective, what it was my participants were describing. And this was really about microaggressions. So microaggressions are characterized as subtle, intentional or unintentional. verbal, behavioural, or environmental hostilities that are based on a social status. And they can occur at both the individual and the institutional level. And within the umbrella term of microaggressions, we have a particular form, which is a micro-invalidation, and that's characterized by hostilities that exclude or negate or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings of it, or experiential reality of a person. And this really felt, from a theoretical perspective, like a really strong fit and fed into a kind of broader framework of thinking about how stigma, marginalization, and neuronormativity kind of plays out in our school system, particularly because of the fact that my participants were saying that although they felt bullied by their teachers, they did recognize that this was coming from what a misguided approach to what might be best for children, but obviously completely invalidated and negated their experiential reality. And in fact, had a knock-on effect in terms of their developing sense of self and their self-esteem. So the implications of that in terms of the health and well-being of my participants, kind of the findings, then thinking about how they connect to the broader literature. So moving away from my participants and thinking more about what we know from the broader field of literature. This connects really strongly with, the invalidation of autistic identity and what that does in terms of the impact, the negative impact that it has on the health and well-being of autistic people. Obviously, there's a clear link in what my participants were saying to the evidence, the growing evidence that we have around masking and the relationship that masking has to autistic burnout, thinking about the effort, but also thinking about, our educations, well, state education, so primary and secondary, equates to 15,000 hours, roughly. So thinking about having to put that level of effort in, 15,000 hours, indeed kind of really connects to the experiences of autistic burnout that we can see in the literature and through autistic people's personal testimony, which I think in turn, perhaps has a really big role to play in the rise that we see in school non-attendance among autistic and otherwise neurodivergent children and young people. And of course, the connections to mental distress, self-harm and suicide, which are of essential and obvious concern amongst the autism and autistic communities. In terms of implications for education policy, there are just so many, and I wasn't really sure what to focus on, but I'm really interested in this particular passage. This is from the Special Educational Needs and Disabilities Code of Practice document. It's about 270 pages long, and there's a lot in there that connects in lots of different ways to, in terms of this study and the broader literature, but this is the one that I think is really relevant. So this particular section relates to thinking about the outcomes, like what is school for all children? It's about having high aspirations, it's about having high expectations of all children and young people, but because this is the SEND Code of Practice, it's talking about those children specifically who have a label of special educational needs, which many autistic children are categorised in that way in our school system. And this document, this government policy document, says that education should enable children to achieve their best, to become confident individuals living fulfilling lives, and to make a successful transition into adulthood, whether into employment or further or higher educational training. But nowhere else in this document, or indeed to my knowledge, in any other policy document, does it actually bring any curiosity to the idea of what best is. When we say achieve their best, what does that mean? What does that look like? In terms of a fulfilling life, what does that mean? What does that look like? And in terms of a transition to adulthood, what happens if that transition to adulthood doesn't look like employment or higher education or training? What if that person's adulthood takes a different trajectory or a different path? So this is where I'm really interested in how we can bring some of the threads from this study, but in terms of the wider understanding of what we know now about the double empathy problem, the issue of neuronormativity and the forces around that, to bring some curiosity to this. When we're thinking about what directs school staff, what motivates school staff, if we're thinking about this in terms of supporting children to achieve their best, how can we bring some curiosity to the idea of what is best? So for me, key questions that are raised by this study that helped inform the work that I did afterwards, and also the work that I'm now doing as a postdoctoral researcher, is thinking about how do we shift thinking in our education system away from medicalized conceptualizations of autism towards a framework which is more aligned with the principles of equality, diversity, and inclusion. So thinking about autistic and otherwise neurodivergent children and young people in the same way as we think about people from other minority communities who have other minority identities. How do we bring this more in line with an EDI agenda? Also, how do we challenge the forces of neuronormativity in our education system and beyond to bring some curiosity to those ideas of what constitutes a fulfilling life? And with that in mind, for autistic students in particular, but for all children in general, how do we prioritise thriving and flourishing? And indeed, that's what my focus and my research is on now, is thinking about, we know so much about autistic distress, but we know so little about what autistic flourishing and thriving looks like, particularly from the autistic perspective or from the perspective of autistic children. So this is really where this study played an absolutely pivotal role in kind of guiding me in my thinking and the work that came after it. So with that in mind, I want to give a heartfelt thanks to my participants for sharing their experiences with me, for trusting me with the experiences they were sharing. I also want to thank my autistic mentors, Barney Anglis, Anne Memott and Philippa Smith, for their generosity and kindness in helping me in my analysis, not just of this study, but in my, my whole research experience. They've been incredibly helpful. My supervisors, Fiona Knott and Tom Lucas, and also the University of Reading's Doctoral and Researcher College, who funded my research. But thank you also for listening. I really appreciate your time. I'd be so interested to hear about the questions that it might raise for you in relation to the implications of these findings and how they might connect elsewhere. If you want to keep in touch, I've got my contact details here. And if you want to know more about the Centre for Autism Wellbeing Hub, which is my postdoctoral project where we're looking at thriving and flourishing, then there's a QR code here for you to take a look at. But thank you very much, and hopefully I've left enough time for some questions.
I think there's plenty of time for questions. We had a technical problem here at UCL, and now none of our computers are attached to things. So I'm joining you via my phone. So fingers crossed for battery life. Jo, may I say, it's just such a pleasure to listen to you. You have wisdom and you have grace and you have thoughtfulness and care. I want to personally thank you. So I was sitting here as someone who used to be a teacher, thinking about my interactions with students and hoping at least that I was good enough. And if not, I wish to just apologise to students if I have never been the best Brian that Brian could be. So there's that humble bit.
Yeah, it is tricky. It's a tricky thing to think about as a teacher. The teachers, I've worked as a lecturer in the School of Education on teacher training, Senko training and so forth. And, I don't think I can say that I've been particularly lucky. I think people who go into teaching really care, really want to do their best. And that was recognised by my participants. They recognised that this was coming from a place of goodwill. But of course, the pressures of neuronormativity are such that even from a place of goodwill, things can go awry. And I think that's the really important thing to consider here.